Okay, welcome everyone to the session. It's great to see so many people joining. I realize a couple of people are still joining, so I'll just give a quick introduction and we'll be kicking off in about 2 minutes. So on behalf of all our colleagues on the Ignition project, our presenters and panelists, we're delighted to welcome you all to our third Community of Practice event. The focus of today's event is on the challenges and opportunities of AI for inclusive education. If you haven't done so already, please say hi in the chat and let us know where you're joining from. And I'd also encourage my colleagues who are working on the Ignition project in SETU and from our partners in the Netherlands, Portugal, and Germany to introduce yourselves in the chat and say hello. So great to see so many participants, and you're all very welcome. My name is Neil Wiley. I'm based in the School of Education and Lifelong Learning here at Southeast Technological University, and I'm your co-host for the event today, along with my colleague Laura Widger, who is the SETU academic lead on the Ignition project, will be chairing the panel session later on. So just some housekeeping before I introduce the speakers. This live seminar is being recorded, and recording will be available via the Ignition LinkedIn page and website later today. So to kick things off, I'll briefly introduce our keynote, the panelists, and the running order, and then hand over to Dr. Madeleine van Oostrom, who is the Ignition project lead, to briefly update us on the Ignition project before the keynote begins. So we are delighted to welcome our keynote, Professor Mike Sharples, to today's Community of Practice. Mike is Emeritus Professor of Educational Technology at the Open University in the UK. He gained a PhD from the Department of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Edinburgh on cognition, computers, and creative writing. His expertise involves human-centered design and evaluation of new technologies and environments for learning. He provides consultancy for institutions worldwide, including UNESCO, UNICEF, universities, and companies. He's a very well-known speaker. I've had the pleasure of seeing Mike once or twice before, and I'm sure many of you have attended his talks in the past. And he's just said he's very busy lately with the advent of ChatGPT. So great to have you with us today, Mike. So Professor Sharples is going to speak for approximately 35 minutes before we move to the panel discussion. If you have any questions or comments, please pop them in the chat window and we'll try to address them during the panel discussion. Our panelists today include Dr. Helen Murphy, who is the head of the School of Education and Lifelong Learning here at SETU. Welcome, Helen, and thanks for being with us. From the Netherlands, we have Matthijs Plaatje, who is a versatile AI expert and lecturer at Hanze University of Applied Sciences, currently doing his doctoral studies on AI, and we look forward to hearing Matthijs' thoughts a little bit later on. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and I'll hand you over to Dr. Madeleine van Oostrom, who's going to briefly introduce the Ignition project. Thanks, Madeleine.
Thank you so much, Neil, and hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and this wonderful panel and this wonderful keynote speaker and all the audience as well, of course, of our Ignition Partners network. So my name is Madeleine van Oostrom. I am the project lead of Ignition. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let's see how my digital literacy skills work out today. I hope not too bad. So here we are. Can you all see my screen now?
Looks good, Madeleine.
Wonderful. So I'm an associate professor at Hanze University of Applied Sciences in the field of digital literacy and inclusion. And I'm happy to be also the lead of this European Digital Literacy Coalition for Inclusion, Collaboration and Innovation in Higher Education, which is the long word for this Ignition acronym project we're sharing today. We are a partnership of 4 partners, and let me please introduce you to these wonderful people who are on this journey with us, as in this family photo. So we are Hanze University of Applied Sciences in Groningen, the lead partner together with the South East Technological University in Waterford Island, who is hosting today's session. Hochschule Bremen, which is our partner in Germany, and of course our Portuguese partner from Institute Politécnico de Bragança. So we have a wonderful multidisciplinary and intercultural partnership whose goal in the end is with this project is, the other way around, is to achieve a stronger capacity of our partners' efforts in increasing and raising digital literacy skills in higher education, and all the stakeholders involved actually, which are of course staff, faculty staff, our students, and of course also the external partners that we collaborate with in our regions. So we have a model of ignition, which you can see on this slide, where when we talk about digital transformation in higher education institutions, we basically talk about three core processes, which is people processes involved in higher education, and technology processes that are supposed to enhance or support these learning processes. For that, we have designed a couple of tasks and a couple of project outcomes that started with the digital agenda and framework, which we have established right now. We have 5 priorities for our Ignition partnership activities, and a framework built on the DigComp Edu framework of the European Commission. We have designed a couple of toolkits to facilitate this increasing the awareness and the digital skill set of teachers, community, and students and external stakeholders. And we are building this community of practice of educators, which today's event is part of course. And also we are building a challenge lab where we can work with our partners in the regions and students and faculty staff on increasing our skills and raising awareness on what we all need to be able to follow up with the digitalization processes in higher education. This is our website. On this slide, we have already some project results published there. We also have our profiles on the LinkedIn page and on our Instagram account, where we post regular updates on our results. So I would really encourage you to follow us and start engaging with us, and also participating actively in any of these outcomes that I just mentioned. And I'm very happy to have you all today here. Many thanks for listening to me. And now I really long to hear Dr. Professor Mike Sharples' keynote. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Madeline. So if you, Mike, would like to kick things off, you can share your screen. Madeline has just finished unsharing.
Okay, thank you, Neil, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Can you see that? Good.
Looks good to me, Mike.
Excellent. Good afternoon, and it's really great to be joining you. I'm sorry I can't do it in person, but this is certainly better than nothing. It's exciting and challenging times at the moment, and also rapidly moving. I had to update this talk this morning because there were new announcements from the OpenAI company that developed ChatGPT last night. So this is what I'm going to be talking about: generative AI for inclusive education. And trying to fit it in with the Ignition's digital agenda for higher education. So I'm going to start off briefly about the state of the art in generative AI, new digital divide, AI literacy, new roles for AI in teaching, learning, and assessment, and then finish off with the ethics of generative AI and about AI for teaching as a caring profession. So where are we now? I'm going to focus just in this first part with GPT-4, because that's the one that's captured all the headlines. But it's also at the moment the most advanced language model. And it's from a company called OpenAI, in which Microsoft has almost 50% share. So GPT-4 is a highly trained text completer and style copier. It can now, as of yesterday, generate up to 100,000 words. So that's 300 pages of text. So that's its context window. It can look back over chats of 100,000 words, and it could generate an entire undergraduate dissertation. It can write in any style, in multiple languages, including minority languages such as Welsh or Catalan. It can be given a direct instruction, and you can see there on the top right, instruction explains string theory in 200 words for an 11-year-old child, and it does a creditable job. It can also interpret text and images, and you can see there an exam question that has been written in French and included as a picture. And the prompt is answer question 1.1a, think step by step. So the instruction is in English, the exam question is in French. It can not only interpret the text in that exam question, but also the diagram as well and answer that question. So it's a general purpose language tool, and more recently, a general purpose language and image tool. And just to give you another example, I gave it a diagram, which you can see on the top left there, with no other instruction than please create a simplified version of this diagram. It then interpreted the text and the construction of the diagram, explained how it was going to simplify it. And then on the right-hand side, you can see its simplification of that diagram and an explanation of that simplified diagram. Interestingly, the captions like understanding and explanation are not in the original diagram. So it's interpreted the diagram and generated its own captions. And again, as of yesterday, GPT now has GPT Plus and GPT Turbo that has plugins for maths, science, media, business. So for instance, it can have a plugin from the Wolfram package that can carry out data analysis and maths computation. It is free. The ChatGPT-4 is free with Bing Chat that includes web browsing. It has a code interpreter that can run and display Python programs. And if that sounds a bit geeky, what it means is that, for example, you can give it a large database and just give it the instruction, visualize that database. And you could see there on the top right, it's been given a census database and it's showing a visual diagram of that database. It also, as of yesterday, it provides custom chatbots. So institutions such as universities could create their own versions of ChatGPT, for example, for tutoring, for lesson planning, for student assistance. And you can see there on the right-hand side, an example, Maths Mentor. I helped parents help their kids with maths, need a refresher on geometry proofs. I'm here to help you. So they've got custom versions of GPT now. It's by no means the only language generator. There are other AI generators. So language models, they include Palm 2 from Google with over 100 languages and versions, for example, for medicine, and available free with Bard Chat, the Google's web browser. Llama 2 from Meta, the company that owns Facebook. What's different about that is that it's entirely open source. So the code is open source and the data it was trained on is open access. 20 languages, it's small, simple, free, and efficient. And Claude 2 from Anthropic, a company that's now associated with Google, but it's a startup. And I'm going to come back to that later. It was trained on ethical principles and can read 75,000 words. It's free to use. As of a week or so ago, it is now available in, I think, 95 countries, but not currently available in the EU for for regulatory reasons. And then image generators, you will have seen those. They're getting better and better. DALL-E 3 from OpenAI, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and Adobe Firefly, which was trained on Adobe copyright-cleared images. And you can see now the photographic quality of the images. So that's on the top right, a generated image from Adobe Firefly. And just coming along are now text-to video generators. And you can see an early example there from a product called Runway. Plus AI that generates computer code, voice, music, and specialist ones such as Bloomberg GPT, which has been trained for business information. So that's where we are now. But as I'm sure you will have heard, generative AI hallucinates. That's the term that's being used, for better or worse. It doesn't know that, for example, it shouldn't invent research studies, that it shouldn't make up academic references. It has no inbuilt explicit model of how the world works. And in human terms, it's amoral. It has no inherent explicit ethics. It's a language model, not a database or a reasoning system. Although it can be attached to databases, in itself, it is not a database. And the OpenAI company is quite open about that. So this is from one of its blogs, from hallucinating inaccurate information to offensive outputs to bias and much more. Language models may not be suitable for every use case without significant modifications. Now, about 18 months ago, I realized that at that point, nobody was talking about the impact of these language models on education. So I tried an experiment to generate an academic essay using, at that point, GPT-3. And I gave it a prompt. You're a student on a Master of Education course. Write a high-quality 500-word essay on a critique of learning styles. The essay should include academic references and evidence from research studies. It should begin, the construct of learning styles is problematic because. I gave that as a prompt. I pressed the submit button, and it produced something that looked like an academic essay. And I was frankly surprised that it could do such a thing. And then over the succeeding months, as new versions came along, I kept testing it with that same prompt. So this was when ChatGPT was released in November 2022. And as you can see, the short essay it produced looks like a student essay. It's got a beginning, a middle, an end, in conclusion. It's got citations and academic references in neat APA style. So it looks like a student essay. But if you look closer at it, as I did, right in the center of that, there is a sentence. In tracking, learners are sorted into groups based on their perceived learning style, which can reinforce stereotypes and limit opportunities for growth and exploration. Gurung 2004. And at the end, a reference to Gurung 2004. Well, I checked the references. There is a Journal of College Reading and Learning, but there is no article from Gurung 2004 in that journal. It made up not only the academic reference, but also the research study that it cites. So why should it do that? Why should it make up a research study? Well, the short answer is that's what it was trained to do. It got to that point in generating the so-called student essay, harmful practices such as tracking and labeling students, and it needed to continue. If it found in its training data appropriate text to continue, it would have done that. If it didn't, it would make it up. And that's what it did. So embedded in its generation of anything, there could be errors. having said that, when I tried it again with GPT-4 in March 2023, it produced an essay that I would have been happy if any student had submitted. I could find no errors in it. All the academic references were appropriate, and the material it cites, the studies it cites, are all appropriate. So one point I really want to emphasize is that there is a big difference between GPT-3, which is currently the generally available free version, and GPT-4. And I wouldn't recommend GPT-3 for any serious academic work, or recommend it for students to use. And as I said, GPT-4 is now available with the Bing web browser, although linked to web access. So how do we respond? Well, the first thing is that plagiarism detectors don't work, the traditional plagiarism detectors, because the text is generated, not copied. There is no source text that you can refer back to. There is a new breed, a new generation of AI-based detectors that claim to be able to detect when an essay or a piece of writing has been generated. They work basically as pattern recognizers, and the basic operation is this, that it's based on the assumption that humans have more variety in their language. So it looks for variety versus predictability in the generated text. So if the text is more predictable, then it assumes it's been written by AI. If the text has more variety of language, it assumes it is human written. OpenAI produced its own detector tool, really just as a demonstrator. That labeled 9% of human written text as written by AI. So 9% false positives. So out of 10 essays submitted by a student, it would misclassify one of those human written essays as being written by AI. The Turnitin company, which is the best known company that provides plagiarism detection, now has its own AI-based detector. That claims less than 1% false positives, so less than a 1 in 100 misclassified. Now, whether you see that acceptable or not, I guess for you and your institution to decide. But there's a big caveat there, which is that that only works with over 20% of AI writing. For short pieces of text, it's less accurate. But I think, for my mind, the most damning issue with AI detectors, it comes from a paper that was written about 2 months ago by researchers at Stanford University. And they analyzed the use of detectors with texts from native English writers and non-native English writers. And they found that AI detectors are more likely to misclassify the text of non-native English writers. And that makes sense, because non-native English writers in general have a smaller command of the English language and are more likely to write in a uniform style. They're more likely to write like an AI. So AI detectors are more likely to misclassify the text of non-native English writers. I've worked with a number of universities now over the last year, and basically the approaches that the universities take fall into 4 categories. Firstly, some have attempted to ban the use of AI, and also some countries and some states, such as New York City schools, have attempted to ban AI chatbots. I think one of the issues is that will then open up a new digital divide between confident students who will continue to use AI and will challenge decisions based on AI detectors, and the less confident students who will be worried about using any sort of AI tools such as spell checkers or style checkers. Institutions could attempt to evade AI by going back to oral exams or invigilated exams, but these are costly and limited. And they can ask students to state when they use AI, but, and I'll come back to this, that will become increasingly difficult as AI is embedded into everyday office tools. Most institutions I have worked with are attempting to adapt, but that requires new methods of assessment, new policies, and new guidelines. A few are embracing AI, and particularly of note, Singapore has had a policy since 2017 as a state of embracing the use of AI, including AI in education. But even then, it urges caution. It recognizes that these AI systems are not foolproof and need to be used carefully. And it involves a long process of building trust. So just to go back to banning, as I mentioned, that confident students will, if a ban is put in place, they will continue to use AI to support their studies because there is no clear way of identifying whether a piece of text has been written by a student or by an AI. And less confident students will be put off using any sort of tools such as grammar and style checkers, machine translation, or AI-based search engines. All students need clear guidance. I've talked with student panels over the past few months, and one of the things those student panels say is that in general, they don't want to cheat, but also they don't want to be left out if other students are using AI. So they want clear guidance on how they can use AI constructively for their learning and coursework. So this appears to be the emerging policy and strategy. And I've looked at various policy documents, and here I just attempted to synthesize what is the emerging policy and strategy, not just in the UK, but worldwide. Firstly, to amend written assessments, to make them harder for AI to generate. For example, based on video, because AI is still not capable of interpreting video, or based on lab work or project work. And in general, move towards more authentic assessments, such as project work, where students apply knowledge and skills to plausible situations. And I can recommend a guide from Heriot-Watt University called A Step-by-Step Guide to Designing More Authentic Assessments. That was written before the era of ChatGPT, but it's still very relevant. You could attempt to reassure and support students in becoming more AI literate and developing strategies for effective learning, explain how they should acknowledge use of generative AI, and manage suspected breaches of guidelines. So this is the emerging policy and strategy. Just want to pick up on one of them, which is explaining to students how they should acknowledge use of generative AI. What's happening at the moment is that the big companies such as Microsoft and Google is already embedding generative AI into its office tools. So on the right, you can see Microsoft 365 Copilot for Word, which is being rolled out from now onwards. As a user has asked for a summary of a document, and it's responded, "I've drafted a summary for your review. Remember to check for accuracy." And then below it, just a set of buttons: rewrite it, make it bullet points, suggest ways to improve the document. So these will be embedded into tools such as Microsoft Word. You will just press a button saying, generate, continue the text, generate the next paragraph, or rewrite the document. They will become part of your workflow. So what do we mean by use of generative AI? Where's the cutoff? At one end of that spectrum, you've got spell checkers, grammar checkers. which students already use, style checkers, which use AI, machine translation to help students who don't have English, for example, as a native language, using AI to brainstorm ideas, to help you continue writing your text, to improve the document, to rewrite the document, or to write an entire document. Where is the cutoff? And I think every institution needs to think about this and make their own decisions. So there's a huge need for AI literacy. And I really do urge institutions and also organizations such as yours, such as Ignite, to work together on developing AI literacy, which is different from digital literacy. It involves understanding the technology, the types of AI and how to use them. For instance, how to write good prompts, the opportunities and the limitations, but also new roles for AI in education, workplace, commerce and entertainment, how to engage constructively with AI, and then the ethics of copyright, plagiarism, bias, and ethical choices. And I'm going to cover these in the next 10 minutes. So at this point, I want to flip the narrative from how will AI impact education towards what are effective and inclusive ways to teach and learn with AI. I'm going to give a few examples. So in 2019, I wrote a book called Practical Pedagogy, 40 New Ways to Teach and Learn, that was based on a series of reports from the Open University called Innovating Pedagogy. And I collated 40 of these and expanded them. And you can see them there. And recently I went back to those 40 new ways of teaching and learning and asked myself, could AI assist those? Could AI enhance those new ways of teaching and learning? And for every one that I looked at, crowd learning, bricolage, computational thinking, teach back, incidental learning, every one of them, I found ways that AI could enhance those methods of teaching and learning. So I'll just give you a few examples. And I've given them kind of evocative terms such as possibility engine. So with a possibility engine, the educator or the student uses AI to generate multiple responses to an open question. And then each student synthesizes and critiques the AI responses to produce their own written answer. So the example I gave here is, let's say, a healthcare course. Is the Hippocratic Oath still relevant for healthcare professionals? And ChatGPT produces a response. Each time you give that prompt, it produces a different response. And you can also try subtly altering the wording of the prompt. Should the Hippocratic Oath still continue to be a basis for ethics? Explain your reasoning. And generally, if you ask ChatGPT to explain its reasoning, it produces a better response. So the students produce a series of responses. They then critique those responses and produce their own written synthesis. Another example, and one I like, is as a Socratic opponent. So in an individual or a group activity, students basically argue with ChatGPT. They engage in a Socratic dialogue with it. And then each student writes their own argumentative essay. So it helps students to learn the skills of argumentation. So the example I give here, can conflict be fruitful? Just a simple prompt. It came back with that response there. And then I took up the first point that it came back with. Engaging in conflict often forces individuals to confront their own beliefs, biases, and assumptions. So I questioned that. But forcing individuals to face their beliefs, biases, and assumptions could just lead to anger and denial. How could that be fruitful? And it responded, you're right. Forcing individuals to confront their beliefs could lead to immediate negative reactions, but the fruitfulness comes from what happens after. And we got into a dialogue. We got into an argument, which went on for quite a few turns. So you can see how students could use this as a partner in argumentation. Another example, and there are plenty of companies now that are starting to develop their own version of this, is to provide students with a personal tutor on basically any topic. I worked in AI in education for over 15 years, developing a tutoring system for neuroradiology. It took 10 years to design that tutor for radiology. Now you have with ChatGPT a tutor for any subject. So this is the prompt here. You're an expert tutor. The example I gave here, you're an expert tutor in English for academic purposes. I'm an undergraduate student. I want you to tutor me in the use of English for academic purposes. You should assume I have limited initial knowledge of academic written English. You should tutor step by step through a chat dialogue, continually assessing my current state of knowledge, asking one question at a time and adjusting your teaching to my response. When I ask, you should provide a summary of my current knowledge of English for academic purposes that I can give to my teacher. Is that clear? And then it comes back with, yeah, absolutely clear, let's begin. And it goes through a structured tutorial dialogue. But what's interesting is it's not just parroting a syllabus. If I, for example, it says, have you written an academic essay? Yes, I replied, I've written an essay on ethical dilemmas in healthcare administration. It picks up that example for use in its responses. If I ask it to give more information, it carries on and gives more information, tutors in more depth. So it's a responsive tutor. And then at the end, I ask it to summarize my knowledge of academic writing, and it comes up with a summary based on the tutoring it's done so far. Another couple of quick examples, a co-designer. So AI assists a group of students throughout a design process to define the problem, challenge assumptions, brainstorm ideas, produce prototypes. And there's something called a temperature setting on models such as ChatGPT. And you can, in your prompt, you can give it a temperature setting. And basically, the higher the temperature setting, the more random it is, the less predictable it is. And you can use that for it to prompt it to be more or less creative. So here, the prompt is brainstorm imaginative ideas for quick and easy ways to reduce energy consumption, temperature setting 1.0. So it can act as a brainstorm assistant, as a co-designer. So these are some of the new ways of teaching and learning with AI. I just want to finish because it's very much a current issue on the ethics of generative AI. The Russell Group of universities, which are the 23, I think it is, leading universities in the UK, produced a really good short guide of their principles on the use of generative AI tools in education. And they also include limitations and ethical issues in this guide. And these are the ones that it identified. So privacy and data considerations. There's risks to privacy from information that users enter, that the information may be used by the company, for example, to continue to train its models. There's potential for bias, societal biases and stereotypes, poorly referenced or incorrect sources. There's a risk of copyright infringement of text that may have been given in training the AI without the creator's consent. It basically trawls the entire internet, the entire World Wide Web, and there will be copyright text within that. Ethics codes may not be embedded within the generative AI tool, and there's an issue of exploitation of, for example, outsourcing data labeling to low-wage workers in poor conditions. These are all genuine concerns and issues, but I think the response can either be to say, okay, we're going to regulate or to ban it, or individually and collectively to look for ways to develop more ethical-based systems. And just to give you an example of that, I mentioned the company Anthropic. They produced a model called Claude. Claude 2 is now available. It's based on what they call constitutional AI. And what that means is that, firstly, privacy and data considerations. The data entered by users is not retained and is not used for training the software. Potential for bias, like other language models, it's given extra fine-tuning with human feedback to try and reduce the obvious sources of bias, such as racial or gender bias. But in particular, this model's trained on ethics codes. It's trained from the outset. Its first initial training is on constitutional principles based on the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and, rather bizarrely, Apple's terms of service. For example, please choose your response that is most supportive of life, liberty, and personal security. And that's used for the initial training of the model. So what I suggest is we need collectively to develop and to work with companies to develop good educational AI. And that's something that I haven't seen happening yet. So it needs to have privacy and data considerations. It needs to reduce the potential for bias, particularly the obvious sources of bias, but also cultural bias, the implicit bias that comes from systems that are being developed in a particular culture, such as US culture. But also to train the models on good pedagogy and inclusive education. There's some training could be, for example, please choose a response that explains step by step how you arrive at the answer. Please choose a response that encourages reflection and critical thinking. And I think as educators and as educational technologists, we have an opportunity to work with the AI companies to develop good educational AI. And lastly, beyond GPT, so it's very rapidly moving field. Microsoft Copilot is generative AI integrated into its Office suite. Google, later this year or earlier next year, is going to announce Google Gemini. It's a collaboration with a UK company called DeepMind, and it's supposedly top secret, but they keep leaking information about it. So it's going to be multimedia. It's going to have problem-solving abilities from its collaboration with DeepMind, and it's going to be networked. And more generally, we will soon see social generative AI, where the AI acts as a guide, a mentor, and a partner in social interactions for learning. So I just want to say that we should use generative AI with care. Teaching is a caring profession, and yet AI is intrinsically uncaring. So we need to add care, both in the design of the systems, but also in their use. We need to rethink written assessment. We need to beware of AI for factual writing because it still makes mistakes, although far less than before. We need to explore AI for critical thinking, for creativity, for argumentation. We need to introduce and negotiate guidelines for students and staff. There's an urgent need to develop AI literacy and to design ethical AI for education. And just a few resources to finish. With a colleague, we've written 2 books now, one called Story Machines, which is about the fascinating history of how computers have become creative writers, and another one called An Introduction to Narrative Generators, How Computers Create Works of Fiction. And I really would recommend the guide from UNESCO called ChatGPT and Artificial Intelligence in Higher Education, a quick start guide. It does what it says on the cover. It's a really useful quick start guide for staff and students to gain an understanding of AI in higher education. That's all I've got to say now. I'll stop the sharing. I hope that's been useful, and I'll hand you back for a discussion.
Thanks very much, Mike. That was really, really interesting, and certainly lots of affordances there for inclusive education. I'm going to hand you over to Laura Widger, who is going to kick off the panel discussion with Helen and Matthias, and we will have some questions just after that. Thanks.
So thanks, Neil, and thanks, Mike. Just to echo Neil's words, an excellent presentation. You've taken a very comprehensive topic and given us a very current, very relevant exploration of some of the issues to consider within the space and the opportunities. So just going to our panel, just to respond to Mike's presentation. So Helen, I'm going to come to you first. And I'm going to invite you to share maybe how the presentation relates to your own professional practice or programs or strategic initiatives that are ongoing here in the university. Or if there's a specific question that you would like to ask Professor Sharples based on what he's touched on in his presentation. So over to you, Helen.
Great. Thanks very much, Laura. Mike, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and you also made it very real for us in higher education in terms of your examples and also the fact that it's just an evolving space. The fact that you had an update last night just shows how fast this is moving, you know. So I've one general, I suppose it's a question and an observation, Mike, of what I see happening across, and this is higher education in Ireland, not just SETU. You have touched on it in your suggested approaches to student assessment, but I'm interested in hearing your views on this. A lot of discussion in terms of using AI to generate student assessment and how do we manage that in higher education. And I suppose, and I completely agree with you, I think it's about us reimagining student assessment, possibly in collaboration with it, as in using AI to do that. What I see happening both in SETU and across higher education at the moment is almost a retrograde step back to written exams. There's a lot of people talking about, but we can confirm knowing and knowledge and comprehension by oral affirmation by the student. So it could be an oral presentation. To me, that's a very retrograde step because it's simply, it's going back to the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, which is the remembering, understanding, which really shouldn't be what we're about in higher education. We should be about developing critical thinkers. So interested in hearing, is that just me that senses this kind of movement back in higher education to kind of where assessment was 20 years ago? And for me, that's worrying.
Okay. Firstly, I think it depends to some extent on your context where you are. UK universities, in general, the ones I've talked with, not just Russell Group universities, but also some of the other more practice-based universities, see it as both a challenge and an opportunity. So the challenge, as you've said, is that students, are already using these tools. You can't put the genie back in the box. So therefore, immediately you need to respond to provide fair assessments. And so there is a short-term issue of how do you provide fair assessments. And some institutions, for example, are moving more towards coursework during the academic year or during the academic session, and then a high-stakes exam at the end. In the medium to longer term, particularly the more practice-based, workplace-based institutions are looking at more authentic assessments. For example, process-based assessments where you are assessing the student throughout a process of developing skills. Having, for example, critical incident assessments where the students are asked to reflect on some incident, perhaps in their placement practice, perhaps in a lab session, to reflect on a critical incident, to describe that incident, then to say, what is your learning from it, and to produce a reflective piece. The AI can't do that because it doesn't have access to that critical incident. So for years, we've been talking about how do you develop more authentic assessment. I think this is the real opportunity to do that. We need to get over the initial, how are we going to cope with the exams at the end of this year? But also it's an opportunity to develop more authentic assessment practices.
Yeah. I think that's fully support that answer, Mike. And you're right. I think it's a medium term. We're moving along this spectrum. Second question, and I will stop at this question, but now I have 100 questions for you, Mike, but I'm only allowed to ask you 2, all right? Because there's many other people who want to ask you questions. But the second one is possibly more of a philosophical question. We talk a lot. My context is mainly lifelong learning and adult learners. Okay, that's mainly where our learners in this school, in this faculty in SETU come from. And we talk about the concept of co-creation quite a lot. And it's often co-creation of a curricula, of a program, of a piece of research. And we have PhD students looking at co-creation models with industry and so on. I'm wondering, is the concept of co-creation, do we take AI as a suitable partner in the concept of co-creation of new knowledge? And if so, who owns the new knowledge?
Yeah. That's a really good question. So firstly, I think it can be a partner in co-creation. I gave that example of it being used as a design aid. And I know that students and academics are already using it as an aid to throughout the design process, not just for brainstorming, but for product design. Now it can be linked to images. You can use it, for example, to generate visualizations of a concept. So it can be used for team creation of some abstract or realized artifact. Who owns it? The shorter answer is that the company doesn't own the output. So the output from it is owned by the people who use it. So if you, for instance, if you work together to create a Google Doc, it would be a shared document. So if you include AI in developing that document or that report, you would have ownership of it. So the companies that produce these tools don't have ownership. In fact, in the US, the outputs of AI can't be copyrighted, which is an issue. And it's an evolving issue that you can't copyright products that are generated by AI. However, if you use the products that you then rework yourself individually or as a team, obviously you can then copyright those.
Yeah, great. Mike, thank you very much for that. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Excellent questions, Mike and Helen. So over to you, Matthias. Similar, if you'd like to share how it relates to your own kind of practice or programs or initiatives, or if there's a specific question that you'd like to ask Professor Sharples.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. A lot of it was very recognizable.
Good. I know you're an expert in this area.
I'm a researcher in AI, and I've studied AI, but I'm also a teacher and course developer at the Master Digital Technology. And of course, I've embraced generative AI. I give workshops also on AI and also specifically on how to use generative AI and how to use it responsibly. And in our course, we gave them the final assignment to explicitly use generative AI to write a white paper for a specific purpose for a specific target audience. So we make students use generative AI in making a product. So and it's a bit easier because in our educational system, we use portfolios for students to show that they show their competences. So it's a little bit easier. They don't have written exams or certain things. So for us, it's easier to give them the assignment of such an assignment. So, but it's an example of how we use generative AI in our course. But I've noticed that I use also generative AI a lot. I also use it for preparing my workshops, to give an outline, to give bullet points for the slides, to fill in certain things in the slides. But then I'm questioning myself, whether or not I could also just let the students do this, because as you have shown, you can let students learn themselves in a lot of ways. But then I'm wondering if you have any views on my future role as a lecturer, because, and maybe not specifically for me, I think I'm literate enough in this field to find my way, but specifically also for the teachers who may not be so much aware of all the possibilities.
That's a really good question. So, I mentioned the digital divide. I think there is already another divide opening up between students and lecturers. So I've seen surveys of students which suggest that around 75% of them have routinely now used AI in their student practices. Maybe not to generate an entire assignment, but to help them brainstorm ideas or improve a lot of them seem to be using it for improving the final quality, the final surface quality of their text. I gave a talk recently to 60 staff at an institution, I won't mention which, and asked them how many of those staff had used AI, and only 2 out of 60 had used it. So there's a huge need, I think, to provide AI literacy, not just to students, but to academic staff. And that literacy has to include how to use it appropriately. Personally, I've been through lots of AI, lots of revolutions in technology, whether the AI in the 1980s with expert systems, with mobile technology, with the internet, World Wide Web. What tends to happen is that that the revolutions are foregrounded at the start, and there's a huge debate about it. But then the big companies want it to recede into the background. They don't want to have a big AI inside label on their products. They want AI to be integrated into the tools we all use. And that's what Microsoft, Google, Apple, Adobe are all trying to do, make AI sit in the background. So we're going to have to change our work practices, because AI will be there helping us and sometimes annoying us in the background. And I think that's got to be the approach. It's not just, do we accept AI or do we ban it? Because AI is going to be much more multifaceted than that. It's about how do we adapt our teaching practices. I think students will use AI as not just a personal tutor, but perhaps as a lifelong learning aid. And they will have, in the future, lifelong companions with AI, which puts a new onus on educators, not just to be purveyors of information or purveyors of knowledge, but to support students and to question students and to challenge students and to assist students throughout their career, and to develop a community of scholars, to go back to some of the original founding principles of universities, to be a community of scholars. And that's why I ended with that, teaching is a caring profession. And the last professions that are going to be replaced by AI are the caring professions. So we need to emphasize that aspect, I think, of education, not just as purveyors of knowledge.
So much. Just as Helen also mentioned, I would love to continue discussing, but I give the word back to Laura.
To be discussed.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Matthias. Excellent contributions and excellent answers, Mike, as expected. We have 2 questions from the floor that I think you've addressed some of these, but from Nolene, she asked what about regulating the companies producing AI so that their outputs need to reference or watermark what's generated by AI, and then institutions can write policies about what percentage AI generated is allowed in the different types.
Okay, so watermarking, that's really a really interesting issue. It's reasonably easy to watermark images, and some companies are trying to do that now. You basically fiddle about with some of the pixels to show that they have been AI generated. It's much harder to do that with text. because so some companies are trying to put a greater proportion of certain words in there. But then if you start changing that text yourself, it's much harder to see whether the text has been watermarked. There are some technical ways you could watermark text with something called Unicode, which is basically the basic, like ASCII code, it's the basic code for letters. And you could have a separate Unicode for AI generated text. So there are ways technically you could watermark text. But I asked Adobe a few weeks ago whether they were working on this, and they said no, not for text at the moment. So I think we could put pressure on companies to try and watermark AI generated text. But it's difficult because, as I say, it's not likely that students will generate an entire essay. They will just use it to improve the surface appearance. They will use it for initial brainstorming. So there's going to be a mixture of human and AI text. But watermarking is technically feasible, but it's not happening at the moment. And I really think institutions and organizations like yours need to work with the companies to develop more practically ethical, but also more pedagogy-based large language models. It's a huge opportunity, and I hope there are going to be some EU research projects that are going to be co-created language models that are designed for education.
So thanks, Mike. Again, excellent answer. And I think you've touched on a lot of this, and I don't think we've time to address it, but you might be able to kind of signal one or two kind of key points to consider. Peter mentions about effective use of generative AI will be a key skill for graduate employability.
Absolutely.
And how do we as educators help students find the golden mean between underutilizing and over-depending on generative AI?
That's really hard. The one thing I would say is work with students. At the moment, students are generally ahead of the staff in terms of using it. So work with student bodies, student representatives. The Russell Group I mentioned, they have had a student panel right from the outset that they've been working with. So I think the one message I would say about that is work closely with the students. Don't just tell them what to do. Again, co-creation, co-create these principles and guidelines with the students themselves, because they're the ones who are actually using these systems for their own learning.
Thanks, Mike. I think, again, an excellent answer, wonderful insights, and great kind of practical advice and direction and follow-up that we could take. I think, as Helen and Matthias and Madeline have all mentioned, I think this discussion could go on for a lot longer, but unfortunately we need to finish for one. So Neil, I'm going to hand back over to you.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, panelists. Mike, thanks so much. It's always great to hear your views on these things, and the fact that you're so up to date. Checking in last night for any updates was great as well.
Yeah, it was a bit private.
On behalf of my co-host Laura, we'd like to thank our SETU Ignition colleagues, Dr. Valerie Brett and Rebecca Sheridan, for their contribution to the event, and also to Matthias, Helen and Madeline for being here and helping us out. So the recording will be available later today via the LinkedIn page of Ignition Erasmus, and we'll also disseminate it to everyone who joined. And we will send a short feedback form just for you guys. If you wouldn't mind filling it in, it'll help kind of inform our next event, which will be happening in spring of 2024. And please do not hesitate to get in touch with us. Any questions? And many thanks again, Mike. And this conversation will take place in the future again. This is the beginning. So let's keep in contact, everyone. And thanks for coming.
Good to see you all.
Take care.
Thanks very much.